Say, okay. I just want to start by, I can't remember what I wanted to say. Oh, the meeting's being recorded. What did I want to say? I cannot remember what I was going to. Oh, quickly, my name is Shohan Illsley. I will introduce myself a bit more in more detail in a little bit, but I'm going to jump into figuring out how to share my screen here again. I do have a handout, or sorry, a PowerPoint, and following this, if folks want a copy of some of the PowerPoint, I am happy to provide it to Mary Lou and Bryce and see if you can forward it to folks. Let me start this up. Sorry, one second. Okay, so again, my name is Shohan Illsley. I'm going to not tell you a lot about myself right now on purpose, other than to say I'm executive director at the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network here in Manitoba. I want folks to know that I lit a smudge before I got started. I always smudge before I move forward, just to get started in a good way, and to also hope and pray that I say the things that people are hoping to hear, and that I also say things that are kind and gentle. And bring no offense to folks, because sometimes when we're talking about anti-oppression, when we're talking about harm reduction, when we're talking about colonial violence, if we are new to figuring out who we are in our relationship to that kind of work, then sometimes things can feel hurtful. And so I just want to acknowledge that I smudge to hope that I'm going to say the right things, or say things that keep you engaged in this conversation, but hopefully also challenge you a little bit. I also want to acknowledge that when Bryce and I first talked about me coming to share here, we had a really big agenda, and I narrowed it down yesterday, and so we're not going to get as much covered as Bryce and I initially hoped to, but I hope that we get some meaningful stuff covered here. So to start, I want to just talk a little bit about how we talk about harm reduction here in Manitoba now. So our presentation is called Harm Reduction 2.0 Beyond the Needle. And we changed this name up actually in almost 10 years ago now. So we used to do a harm reduction workshop, and we realized that just talking about harm reduction was not enough anymore. We had to start talking about beyond the needle. Like there's so much more to harm reduction. Harm reduction really is a model of care. And in fact, you can work from a place of harm reduction and not do supply distribution, and vice versa. People do supply distribution and absolutely are not grounded in harm reduction work. So I want to acknowledge that, and acknowledge that this came with us starting to shift to do some of that anti-oppression and anti-racism kind of work. We could do supply distribution for 100 years and still have to do supply distribution if we don't change systems. And our hope is that ultimately in 100 years, we've changed systems so people have proper access to services. So supply distribution is a moot point, just like condom distribution in some spaces is a moot point, right? We want everyone to be able to access whatever it is that they need without any stigma related to it. Okay, so I'm going to set a little bit of context before I get to what I really hope to talk about. So one of the things that I want to acknowledge is that as we think about anti-oppression and understanding oppression is a lot of work. In fact, there's university courses around oppression work. And so the wheel that you see in front of you is the oppression wheel that an Indigenous organization here in Winnipeg uses. It's called the organization's called Ganiganichuk, and it is an Indigenous-led organization here. And they've worked with battered women support services from BC, and they developed their oppression wheel. And when we look at this oppression wheel, lots of us can see, hey, there's some spokes that might be missing. Gani knows that, and they do this intentionally because that's part of their activity. But we want to recognize that there's a bunch of different spokes on this wheel that we can be thinking about when we think about when we think about oppression. So, you know, sexuality is not on here, age is not on here, ableism is not on here. There's a bunch of different things. And so in presenting this wheel, I want to acknowledge that I'm not an expert in anti-racism. I'm not an expert in anti-oppression work. What I'm hoping to do here is to share a little bit of what I've learned over the years from some of the experts in my life, and some of the people who have been so generous and kind to share some of that information with me. But when we look at this oppression wheel and when we think about anti-oppression work, we really, it seems so far off because this is such a big theory that we think like, okay, how do I as a human being who lives and works in a certain space impact this? How do I change these systems? How do I end oppression in these systems? And so I want to kind of narrow it down a little bit, which I know this is the first of some trainings that the Nurses Association is going to be taking on. And so you're going to get some of this, I'm sure, along the way. But when we look at the wheel, I want us to then think about a couple things, depending on who we are in this space. And you're going to have to identify who you are in a minute. But when we look at that wheel, we want to recognize that not all people uphold white supremacy. Supremacy upholds all white people. Not all cis men uphold patriarchy. Patriarchy holds up all cis men. Not all heterosexuals uphold heteronormativity, but heteronormativity upholds all heterosexuals. Not all able bodies uphold ableism, but ableism upholds all able bodies. Not all the rich uphold classism, but classism upholds all the rich. Not all the privileged uphold systems of oppression, but systems of oppression are upheld by the silence of those of us who are privileged. And I wanted to state that whole entire, because as we talk about whiteness, as we talk about heteronormativity, as we talk about in our practices and start to think about it, this is some of the stuff that hits us and we're like, wait a minute, it wasn't me. It's not about you. It's about who are we in the context of those oppressions and what is our role to start to dismantle them. And so again, the oppression wheel seems massive. So now I want us to start to bring it down a little bit to start thinking about those systems. And so on the outside of this, you can see the red, in the red, I've labeled a bunch of systems. There's a whole bunch of other systems, but what we want to acknowledge is that all of those systems have been developed in the context of this structural and colonial violence that was designed and based on white supremacy, designed to oppress, in Canada, primarily Indigenous people. And of course, now those systems continue to oppress all BIPOC people. But also recognizing that those systems also oppress some of us in different ways. And so when we think about who we are in those systems, we can now start to think about how do I relate and how can I do some work to change those systems. And for those of us who are like in this circle, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but where the blue's written, that's kind of where our job and our work might lie, and maybe some of other work that we do lies in that area. And recognizing that these systems impact us in our work, they impact us inside in our families, in our groups, and they also impact us individually. And of course, they impact some people more than other people. And so how in the world do we start to understand how we relate in this dynamic in all of these systems, recognizing all of these systems work very closely together. We have a massive activity that we typically do around this system. We're not going to do it today, but it's really about recognizing how those systems work together without even having to talk to each other, without ever having to even relate to each other or know who's working in them. They work very well together, which is the ultimate form of oppression, right? When the people, we don't have people oppressing us, we have systems that are oppressing certain folks, right? Are oppressing all of us, but some people more than others. So what I hope to do now is kind of start to transition us to think about who we are in those systems and the work that we have to do to figure out who we are in order to start to navigate and change those systems, recognizing this is, I've been doing this kind of work actively trying to do anti-oppression and anti-racism work for probably about 10 years. And I can tell you that I feel like I've moved a millimeter in understanding and knowing. So this is a lifelong journey. Today, what I hope to do is get folks to think about where you individually can start, because really it is us who has to do the work to dismantle these systems. Or for those folks who would like to just reform some of those systems, start to think about what that reform could look like. I'm going to share some words from some of the experts in my life and the kind people who have mentored me over the years. And these are words that I keep dear to me when I think about the work that I do and why I do the work and how I do the work. So this here is Tasha Spillett. She's one of our young Indigenous leaders in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, in fact. And she is also an author, and she launched when she launched her first graphic novel, somebody asked her about what reconciliation meant to her. And she said this brilliant quote, "It is not our responsibility to repair a broken relationship with a continually abusive partner." And what this spoke to me was really, what is my role as a settler, as somebody who benefits from those systems? What is my role in trying to repair this broken relationship? And sometimes people are thinking a lot of the work should be on Indigenous or BIPOC communities to work on these relationships, or to educate white people about what it is that needs to be worked on. And this really spoke to me to say, wait a minute, I think maybe the work really is not our Indigenous communities' work. I also want to share this. This is Jerry. She's my Sundance sister, and this is a pretty powerful quote by her. It says, "I was born Indigenous, and I'm going to live my whole life being proud of being Indigenous, and I'm going to die Indigenous. I don't want to die because I am Indigenous." I also want to introduce Dr. Marcia Anderson. If you do not know who she is a doctor here in Manitoba, but she is also a very strong Indigenous leader, and she is also one of the experts in anti-racism work. And she's over at Angamazwin at the University of Manitoba, which is their medical program. And she also has like many doctors, has lots of different roles as well. But she's one of the folks who are teaching us how to be better relatives and how to do our anti-racism work. And one of the things she recently did was this imperatives to anti-racism work in leadership, in which she was doing some mentoring and sharing for folks who are in leadership positions on how to do some anti-racism work. And one of the things she said was really important, and something that we've been practicing for a long time, is self-location. So when we are in spaces with folks, how do we fit, and how do we introduce ourselves into those spaces? And often we don't introduce ourselves. So part of self-location includes knowing our own stories and our motives for wanting to do this work. Why are we here? Why is this work important for us? And what are our motives? And these are some of the things that when you work with BIPOC communities, they will ask you, what is your story? Who are you? And what are you doing here? And what do you want? And I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a minute, but what I want us to start thinking about collectively is, what is our story? How do we tell our story? How do we have access to be able to tell our story? Recognizing that some of us are more privileged than others to understand our story, where we come from, where our families come from, than others. So I just want to acknowledge that this kind of work isn't as easy for everybody due to our own personal stories. I also want to share this. This is again Dr. Marcia Anderson. So a note to organizations considering anti-racism work: when whiteness is centered, we center what whiteness is willing to change. When Black and Indigenous folks are centered, we center our potential, our rights, and our strengths. Only one of these approaches will lead to change. And so as we start to think about how we do anti-oppression work, I hope this is always in our forefront. Who's doing the work, who has to be there, and who should be leading our spaces as our systems start to be dismantled. I also want to share this. The big quote is also probably why it's easier for white academics to publish and make tenor about colonization. The archives don't haunt them, the trauma doesn't live in their bones, and they don't have to put the books down to breathe. And this is one of my dear friends, Candace, up top here, who is a student, and she said, sometimes I feel like I'm going to die in class, and non-Indigenous students are asking if they have to spell Beothuk properly on a test. And I share this to remind us to think about how we talk about certain issues, how we talk about anti-oppression, how we talk about anti-racism, and who we're talking and having those conversations with, because for some, this is literally their blood memory. And for us, which of course there's going to be some visceral responses when folks have ancestors our parents or themselves have been impacted by these systems in such a harmful way, while some of us have never even had to think about how the systems could potentially harm us because they don't. Okay, so now who in the hell am I? And so I on purpose have not introduced myself at all. And I believe we have quite a few people on this line. So I just want people to think for just 1 minute. I didn't introduce myself on purpose because I wanted to prove a point. I want you to think about the fact that you know nothing about me. How does that feel right now? How does it feel? The information I've given you, how valid is that? What does any of that mean? So how does it feel to have me sitting here holding this space, holding this screen, and know anything about me besides my name? You have no idea where I come from. You don't know how I know the things I know or the things I'm sharing. How do you make any connection with me without any introduction at all to who I am? And how do we start to build a relationship when all you have is my name? And how do you connect to anything I've set up to this point? And so I want us to just acknowledge for 1 second that lots of our interactions, and in fact, most of our interactions in our day probably feel like this, where somebody comes in, or you might go into a space and you tell people something, and the only thing they know about you is your name and maybe your position. How do we do work? How do we do meaningful work if we're not in the context to build a relationship? So one of the things that, and one of the reasons Bryce asked me here today is that about 7 or 8 years ago, I started to build my land acknowledgement. And I wanted to build a land acknowledgement that was not a checklist and was not the standard, treaty territory, blah, 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 blah. I didn't want that kind of a land acknowledgement. And so in the work that I do, I always introduce myself in a different way, which you're going to see a bit of it today. But I also have the privilege to provide the harm reduction training in the province. And our training, our anti-racism, anti-oppression training is actually a 3-day training. And on day 1, I spend 45 minutes to an hour just introducing myself, who I am. And I'll read through this list in a minute about why I do that. And then we go into groups, and then everybody else has to introduce who they are. And then we stop and we relate to each other, and we make connections with each other, and then we feast. And that takes a whole entire morning. And what I can tell you is that is the most important part of all of those 3 days. Bryce participated in that, so he got to experience some of that as well. But it is the most important part. It's also the part that when people evaluate our training, they say, I could have left after that and understood what harm reduction was. So why do I take so much time to introduce myself? There's lots of important reasons for me to share with you why I do that. One is that my upbringing taught me to do that. So I was raised in both an Icelandic and an Indigenous community. And both of those communities taught me that when I introduce myself, I am who my parents are and who my family is. So that's one of the reasons. I also do it to locate myself in the space that we're together in, whether it's virtual now or whether we're in somebody's community or whether I'm in somebody's office with them. Introducing who I am is really important. It's also important because if I get to stand or sit or have the floor, it's important for folks to understand what my biases and values are. And those of us who have been doing harm reduction work for a long time have worked really hard to be non-judgmental, but our biases and values are almost impossible not to show, right? So it's really important that those are apparent when I have the floor. People have to understand who I am and what those biases. It's also important because this is where we get to start to make connections and build relationships. We're all related and we're all connected in some way. And so by starting to introduce who I am, my hope is that people who I'm talking to start to make connections to my story too, because those are the foundations to us building relationships. And as we know, to do any of our work, we have to have relationships. That is the harm reduction and working from a harm reduction place. I also must be clear on who I am as I share space with Indigenous relatives, with my Indigenous relatives. So we have a long colonial history of settlers and white people and white presenting people coming in and telling Indigenous people things in a very colonial manner. And so if I'm sharing space with Indigenous folks, it is really important for me to be clear on who I am and what my motive to being in that space is. If I am not clear on that, that is just me replicating colonization and colonial relationships. And I want to stress how important this is, folks. I have been in spaces where I did my introduction, and then I got a call from a leader in an Indigenous community who heard it, who said, "Can you come to my community and introduce yourself?" And I was like, "Oh, you want me to come out and introduce myself? Like a 1.5 hour trip? All I'm going to do is introduce myself for an hour, leave that community." And she was like, "Yep." And I said, "All right." And this was a First Nations community. And I literally went in, spent 1 hour introducing myself, answering any questions, and I left that community. And it was imperative to building a relationship with those folks because they needed to know who I was. I went in and I introduced myself to their leadership, and then I left, and their leadership decided if I could come back to their community again. And I had to be committed to going out there just for an hour, just to introduce myself, which was awkward enough to just talk about myself, but had a very significant impact in the relationship building with that community. And in fact, it's happened time and time again since that one incident. And also, who I am and where I come from is also my land acknowledgement. So at the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network, our land acknowledgements we have relationships with them. So each one of our teammates have had to spend time figuring out who they are and how they relate to the spaces. And what that looks like for our Indigenous teammates, what that looks like for our Black teammates, what that looks for our biracial teammates, and what that looks like for our teammates who are settlers is different. But that's the beauty in our acknowledgements. We have a relationship with it, and we can build it to be what it needs to be for us. And I will tell you that I've had many people, even at conferences when I've done my own quick land acknowledgement, people have said, "Can you send me your land acknowledgement? That's very good. I would like to copy that." I'm like, no. You have to do the work, and you have to build your own land acknowledgement. So what I'm going to do now, folks, now that I've explained why I introduce myself and why I start to situate myself with a big introduction, is I'm going to give you a little snippet of my introduction. You're not going to get the whole thing, but I'm going to give you a little bit. And then we're going to break off into groups because I want you to start introducing yourself a little differently with some of our friends here on this Zoom call. So who am I? So my name is Shauna Illsley. I also answer to Shohan. It's Gaelic spelling. I'm Irish, which a tiny bit of Irish, which I found out thanks to Ancestry DNA. But I didn't have a relationship to that spelling in my life until I knew that. My doctor was Gaelic, and he told my mom to spell it that way. My spirit name is Sacred Bear Woman, and my pronouns are she and her. The Indigenous land that I was raised on is in northern Manitoba, and the caretakers are the Innu, the Anishinaabe, the Dene, and the Inuit. So those are the folks who continue to take care of the land that I was raised on and continue to model to me how to take care of that land. So my home fires burn in the Paw, Manitoba, in Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and in Churchill, Manitoba. Those are my home communities. In 1996, I relocated to Winnipeg to come to university, and I've actually lived here ever since. So my home communities are all signatories to Treaty 5. And in doing my land acknowledgement, I want to really stress that the land and the people were there long before the treaties. And the treaties are really the colonial identification of the land. And when we think about treaties, we often think about the relationship between the Indigenous communities and the government of Canada. And it's really important for us to acknowledge that the treaties are actually between the non-Indigenous communities and the Indigenous communities as well. And so these communities promise to share the resources with these 31 First Nations communities. So that treaty said we promise to share resources. What we know is that if I don't know how to go back, sorry. Oh, there we go. If these communities had shared their resources, then all of these communities would look the same. And because some of these communities clearly don't have the same resources like access to education, access to housing, access to healthcare, we know that somebody didn't uphold their end of the bargain, right? And so in thinking about harm reduction, I want to acknowledge that our Indigenous harm reductionists have said harm reduction, we've been practicing it for a very long time. It is how we have survived colonial violence for 500 years. And so in saying that, or sorry, now for over 500 years. And so in saying that, part of us recognizing and undoing and thinking of anti-oppression work is also thinking about how do we honor these treaties? Because until we honor those treaties, then we will never be able to celebrate completing harm reduction work. All right. So who am I? So my family are all settlers, all four of my grandparents. This set of grandparents came from Iceland in 1876. They settled in what was called the Icelandic Reserve here in Manitoba. My great-great-grandfather here came over when he was 9 years old with his mother and settled. And his mother actually was the only woman who claimed land and claimed a homestead. And so for our family, understanding that really is about recognizing what that means to our family, that our grandmother claimed stolen land from Indigenous people. Also having our stories, we're storytellers, us Icelanders, having our stories and recognizing and honoring the Indigenous families that taught my family how to live here and how to thrive and survive here, which they would not have done if it wasn't for the Indigenous community. And primarily, there's some particular Indigenous families who actually ensured that my grandmother and her children survived while they were here. My great-grandfather here eventually took his family up to Churchill. He was old and he was getting sick and he wanted to return to the sea. And so he took his family up to Churchill, and that's where my family, part of my family grew up. This is my Amma and my grandfather. This is my Amma who made her way to Churchill with her grandfather. And she, the two of them actually had a trap line up in Magoose River, which goes up into what is now called Nunavut. But my Amma was also adopted by the Dene people, the Sayasi Dene people. And also was a huge social justice activist before that was even words that were used, and supported the Dene people in Churchill. And so my grandfather unfortunately died very young, and my Amma carried on that work. And my grandparents actually owned a grocery store in which they supported many of the Dene people up there. My Amma is the matriarch. We are a matriarchal family. And when she passed away, my aunt, who's the oldest, became the matriarch in that family line. My grandparents, started a business, and it was called the S&M Supermarket, which the joke is always, of course, I ended up being in sexual health when my parents' grocery store was called the S&M, but it stood for Sigurdsson and Martin, which is our two family names. And so I just want to acknowledge that I spent my summers in Churchill with my father, and what do I want to say? I spent my summers in Churchill with my father, and I spent my school years in the PAW with my mother and my stepfather, who I'll introduce in a minute as well. And in Churchill, food security was a non-issue because my father managed the grocery store up there. This is my father. My father has 9 children with 5 baby mamas. He is a very funny, charming person, but he also owned a grocery store. So I like to remind him that that's likely why he has so many baby mamas. But my father, being Icelandic, is also a storyteller, and he is also a pilot. And he has some pretty amazing, him and my Amma had some pretty, and my aunts have some pretty amazing stories of witnessing genocide of Indigenous people, and witnessing the atrocities that the government of Canada did to both the Sayasi Dene as well as to Inuit families in northern Manitoba. And as a pilot, my dad flew into small communities to take groceries, like fly-in only communities, and witnessed a lot of the harms and the continued legacy of those harms in those First Nations communities. I'm not going to get into many of those stories or any of those stories because of time, but I just want to share that. This is my mother's dad. He immigrated to Canada with his family around 1900. And he was a part of the Legion. He fought in both world wars. And so for our family, part of our story and our understanding reconciliation is trying to figure out what that means to our family when our grandfather came over and fought in 2 world wars. My grandfather was a very kind and very, very gentle man, and he lived to be 89 years old. And so I got to spend a lot of my childhood with him. And he was very kind, but he was very quiet and was not actually a storyteller. So I don't know a lot about this side of my family, but he settled in Saskatchewan with his family and eventually made his way to the Paul, Manitoba, where he married my grandmother. This is my biological mom and my stepfather. So this is, my mom is English. Her mom is also, I introduced my grandfather, but her mom is also English. My stepfather is Swampy Cree from Opaskwayak Cree Nation, and he's been in my life my whole life. And he also adopted me in the Indigenous way of adoption when I was 12 years old and has been fathering me ever since. And he is also a very kind, very gentle, funny man, and is well known in northern Manitoba. And he was the person to teach me about love beyond blood, that blood had nothing to do with how we love our relatives and how we connect with our relatives in a really meaningful way. What I also want to say is that my early years in the PA, I grew up in what was called the ghetto, and I spent 8 years there. And the first 8 years of my life were where I really learned about harm reduction. And so I grew up in a community that we were one of the few white families in that community, but I grew up in a community where people completely took care of each other. So regardless of stereotypes around ghettos, and poverty and all of that kind of stuff, that was the only community I have ever lived in to this day where people just took care of each other, where I could walk into any house and an auntie would feed me, and I never had to ask for food. I never had to, I wasn't sent away because it was supper time, but it was a community that really bonded together and took care of each other and really modeled harm reduction for me at a very young age, and also modeled to me how unsafe and how harmful systems were. So at a very young age, I was taught that I do not talk to social workers. You never talk to social workers. If ever anyone tries to talk to you at school, you don't talk to them. You call your mom. And so there's this long-standing understanding that those systems can be harmful to me and my family, and that those systems can actually break up me and my family. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I also want to acknowledge my mom's resiliency and strength to survive those systems that worked really hard to harm her when we were younger. This is my mother-in-law. She is the one, she's the one with the black fur around her coat. When I told her I needed a picture, she said, well, use this one, because that's her and Auntie Sandra. They were going to Tina Turner and they had their hair and makeup done. So that's the photo she said I could use. My mother-in-law is Indigenous. She's from Birch River, and she is with Sapatayak Cree Nation. That is her home community. And she also is a survivor of residential school. And she went to Mackay Residential School at the age of 4. And she graduated out of that system at the age of 16. And I just want to, all I'm going to say about this, just for time's sake, is Edna, the residential school that my mother-in-law went to still stands. And in fact, it was purchased by a new church, and it now houses programming for hard to house folks and folks who are impacted by poverty. So basically that school still provides supports for people who are the children of survivors of that building. And so I just always have to acknowledge that. And that's in Dauphin, Manitoba, if folks are not familiar. So this is my mother-in-law. She is the matriarch of our family. She's also a nurse and has worked with Health Canada for, I think she just celebrated her 30 years with Health Canada. This is my other mother. Her name is Leslie Spillett. She comes from northern Manitoba as well, but she lives down here in Winnipeg, and she adopted me. We adopted each other in ceremony actually many years ago. And then I just want to quickly introduce my family, and then I'm going to turn over some of the work to you folks. So this is my partner, Quentin. We have been together since high school, those two little babies there. We were 17 and we had a teen pregnancy and have been together ever since. He is, wait, I'll get to that in a sec. This is my immediate family. And when I say immediate, please know I'm part of a massive, big Sundance family. So this is just a little bit of who our family is. But you'll see in here, my daughter Justice, she just turned 26 2 days ago. And then my son is in here. He's just turned 28 years old. He's actually our nephew, but we adopted him when he was 10, which is a really common thing to do in northern Manitoba. And so he's blessed to have two mothers. And then when my husband and I grew up and could afford groceries, we had two more kids. And so we have Charlie, who is 13, and Jersey, who is 11. And then the other person in our photo here is our child-in-law. And they have been in our lives for just over 3 years. That's our daughter's partner. So this is our immediate family. But again, we're part of a much, much larger family. One of my biases is we do follow traditional ways of knowing in our home. My husband is a lodge builder and he's also a pipe carrier, and we participate in Sundance as well as many other ceremonies throughout the year. And in fact, our family is struggling a little bit, just like many other Indigenous families, because ceremony and being with our relatives all together has not happened in the last 11 months. And so things, some of us are struggling because of that. I also have a Master's of Science from the University of Manitoba. Like I said, I'm the Executive Director of the Harm Reduction Network, and I've actually been here for 13 years. But I like to think that I was born into harm reduction, and I just turned 44, so I think I have about 40 years of doing harm reduction work. So that's me. So the whole point of that, folks, was kind of to model for you a little bit of how we spend some time thinking about who we are and putting it down so that people can start to relate to it. And my hope in that entire introduction, which was a really fast one, is that I made some sort of connection with each of you, and recognizing that by figuring out who I am in this massive world is how I do my anti-oppression and anti-racism work. And I actually can't do that work until I figure out who I am. And I'm still figuring out who I am. So now what I'd like to do is we're going to break you into breakout rooms. We're going to put you together four or five, I think, to a room, Mary Lou. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you want, yeah, 4 or 5. And what I'll do is I'll pause the recording. And so sorry about that voice earlier.
Sounds good.
There's about 25 seconds before all the rooms close.
Okay.
And everyone is back.
Okay. Okay, folks, so my instruction was to go till 8 o'clock, and I'm hoping to just do a little bit of a debrief with folks. And then I think what we'll do is I'll hang out on here. So if anyone has questions, you can either raise your hand or put them in the chat. But I'll also give you my email if anyone wants to follow up via email. Sorry, let me re-share my screen. Okay. So, unfortunately, because there's so many of us, we can't, like, normally we would all debrief together. This is the hard part of having massive sessions like this. But hopefully you were able to debrief a little bit in your breakout room just now. But after this, what I would hope that folks do is you start to really reflect and spend some time thinking about and learning about who you are and what your relationship to the land and to the caretakers of the land are. And I want you to know that as I travel throughout Canada and North America doing my work, I also am responsible for learning about the places and spaces that I'm going to and how I relate to those spaces. And so this work is never done, and figuring out who I am and how I relate really is at the core and the foundation to doing really good anti-oppression work and doing really good anti-racism work.
Can I just jump in to let you know that we're not seeing your screen?
Oh, oh, really?
Yeah. So it might be that you just have to select like as long as it's showing and
There we go. Sorry, I think I pushed the wrong one. So anyhow, so now
we're
we
still not seeing it. Oh yeah, it's starting. Hold on. It says sorry. I just really don't want to be I keep cutting you, but it
uh,
still says like has started sharing screen, but it's a black one. It's a black screen.
okay. So let me try this one more time, and if not, it's okay. I can probably go back to, or I could do it without the screen. Um, is that better?
Still
Oh,
show no.
okay. Okay. Well, then I'm going to stop sharing and just show you my beautiful face. How's that?
That
Okay.
works.
Okay. So one of the things that we hope to, like, some homework for those of you who are actually interested in embarking on the next phases to do this is to really start to think about what you can do to start to build your introduction and your land acknowledgement. We know that land acknowledgements can no longer be housekeeping items. We know that we have to have a relationship to them. And so in figuring out what your land acknowledgement means to you, I hope that you also start to challenge the organizations that you work for in thinking about what their land acknowledgement means to them in their work. Because lots of our institutions are saying the same thing, and there is no meat or no substance to those land acknowledgements. And so think about that. And then I also want to, I was, my last image is to come back to that systems um, um, flow chart that has the systems on the outside and us in the middle, right? And so I want you to think about, now that we're starting to think about who we are and how we relate, think about how we relate in that circle, because we are the individual in the middle, but we're also the family members and the loved ones who surround the people in the middle. We're also the healthcare providers and the workers and the folks who can make a difference in somebody's life by being kind to them when they come into our spaces. And so we're also the only people who are going to change those systems. When we think about people who are most oppressed and most impacted by that structural and colonial violence, they don't have the capacity to change those systems. They're not, nobody's listening to them. They're not even allowed in our doors, for Pete's sakes, in some of our spaces. And so we really have a responsibility to start to think about who we are and how we can start to, quite frankly, burn down some of those systems. And for those of you who are not yet ready for abolishment, then to maybe start to think about how to reform some of those systems. But at the end of the day, a lot of those systems have to be abolished. They just cause way too much harm to our loved ones and to some of us. And so now, in order to do that, it's really important for us to start to think about who we are and how we situate ourselves. That's it for me. I will hang out. I'm also going to put my email in the chat. So if anyone wants to reach out to do any sort of debrief, because I do recognize, I know that for some folks who look like me, who are white and have a very long white history in this country, and a history that includes genocide, it could be tough. And it's really important that you talk to other white people about what that means. One of the things that we find in some of our spaces is we will start to talk about things, and then we see people who, BIPOC people, white people going to BIPOC people to get support around that whiteness and that privilege. And it's really important that if this stuff is stirring up things for you, that you come to people like me who also have similar histories. It is not the job of people who have been oppressed to make us feel better about that oppression. And so you are welcome to connect with me via email if you need. And I'm also going to hang out for a little bit if anyone has questions and want to hang around.
Thank you so much. And thank you for Bryce also for connecting us all and allowing for this talk to happen. I just wanted to make sure I give you a big shout out because it's really because of you, and you made this happen. And also just like a acknowledgement as well that this is like a beginning of a very long conversation and all the work that needs to be done. And the reason that the Harm Reduction Nurses Association wants to commit to that work is because harm reduction nursing remains extremely white. And this is not something that we've explicitly engaged with. And we assume that as harm reduction nurses, we're just going to be anti-oppressive because we're nurses and we're so great. But we really fail to engage with really explicitly what it means to be in this space and why are you here? Why are you in this space? And I think I've had conversations that are very important with nurses who say there's a bit too much of a savior complex going on. And there needs to be some deeper thinking about why are you in harm reduction? And if you are a nurse that benefits from white privilege and that white supremacy is upholding you as a nurse, if you don't engage with that in that, and then you're in that space and you're also unclear why you're there, and you can cause a lot of harm. And this is us as an association also wanting to signal that we're, you know, very aware of that. There's a ton that needs to be done, and we're just happy that we could start a conversation with you because I think you really role model that extremely well. So thank you.
And I do want to say something just about that, because the evolution of harm reduction's always belonged in the community, and something has happened lately where all of a sudden health, primarily like public health, thinks you own harm reduction. And I'm sorry, nurses, you're fantastic, but you do not own harm reduction. People who use drugs and people in the community own harm reduction. And so if you are doing the work in those institutions, you need to think about what is your relationship to that group, so that, because you have to engage them, they have to be in your spaces to do the real work.
Well, thank you for sending us off onto a very important path, and we hope to be leading some of that conversation. It needs to happen. It's way overdue. And if not now, I don't know when. So thank you so much for that. And thanks everyone. Just so nice to see so many faces and for you to take the time to be here. So yeah, I mean, off you go. Stay safe, take care of yourselves and your communities, and hope to see you in person at some point in the near future. And just sending a lot of love and courage to all of you.
And for those of you who are making comments, please know I'll read all of them, including your recognizing your crappy other land acknowledgements that you've had to read.
And if people want to stick around and have questions also for you, feel free to jump in. I'm just gonna do housekeeping stuff. And stop the recording.